Hi, welcome to Bad Takes. I'm Laura McGann, the executive editor of Grid. I'm here with my co-host and contributing editor to Grid, Matthew Iglesias.
Hello.
Hey, Matt. So, this week, do you have a bad take for us?
I do have a bad take. I should say, we don't normally, want to just dunk on randos, but this is a take by someone named Themperer Kennedy using that handle on Twitter, and it was very popular. It was going viral when I saw it, over 9,000 retweets, over 66,000 likes. So, it says, the fact that chess is divided into gendered leagues should tell you something about the real history and reasons behind the gender division of sports. Men are scared of being made to look inferior to women. So I don't think that's true.
I also think that's a bad take. But can I tell you just on one level why I like this take? Is because it's just, whoever wrote that's some good news judgment, pulling in chess to layer on top of this idea. We've got a big chess scandal. So it's just sort of,
chess has been in the news.
I like the news, the news hook to this idea. But ultimately, it's the bigger idea here that he's driving at. That's the bad take.
Right. So but I do want to talk about chess.
Yeah, let's
because,
talk about chess.
This is meant to be illustrative. I mean, on the most superficial level, what's bad about this take is that chess is actually not divided into gendered leagues. The way chess works is there are open tournaments in which women play against men, and then there are women-only tournaments. But it's just it's not factually true that men don't compete against women. Women enter open chess tournaments all the time. Some of them do quite well. There's a woman named Judith Polgar, who I think is the top-ranked woman ever. She's a fantastic chess player. I mean, she not just she could beat me at chess, obviously. Lots of people could. But most really experienced professional male chess players are not as good as the top women in the game. But there is separate women's competitions anyway, because in part the very highest tiers of chess are very male-dominated. There's a lot of interest in getting more girls interested in playing chess. And I mean, I don't know if there's chess science on this, but the thought is that creating women-only tournaments can both be a kind of a more comfortable space, but also will create women champions, women grandmasters who become role models because, there's a long-standing view that you have to see it in order to be it, right? And so, that's in this particular case of chess, it's actually super duper duper clear cut. The women are not prohibited from competing against the men.
Right.
A separate women's category is created to benefit women, to generate women role models, to get more girls interested in chess, because we think that participating in chess is something that is, I don't know, good mental discipline. It's obviously not that socially important whether people play chess or not, but I think it's considered a good thing for people to do.
Sure.
That there should be more encouragement.
Right. I really liked an interview that Anna Dean at Grid did with Jennifer Shahade a few weeks ago. It's Jennifer Shahade she's a chess champion 2 times in the Open League. She's a woman, and she runs the women's program at the National Chess Foundation. And she loves chess, and she wants more girls and women to play chess. And she did a good job explaining why they have this women's program. And it's really even as simple as, you see the drop-off. She said that girls and boys, there's always more boys playing chess from an early age. But the big drop-off she sees is around kind of, middle school, age 12, and that's when kids are starting to get more competitive. She said it's as simple as there are these travel tournaments, and girls go, and sometimes they're the only girl there, and it's all boys, and, who do they stay in a room with, and et cetera. And so she's what she's seen is by having this girls program is more girls see it as fun, that it's a fun thing to do. They're making friends with other girls, and it's just fostering more participation in the game. And she's hopeful that over the long run, you'll have more women who are champions in the Open League. It'll just create that virtuous cycle.
Well, and one of the things she says is in addition to separate women's tournaments and the women's grandmaster rank, that she has tried to create just girls-only spaces at the gender-integrated tournament. So there's a club where you can hang out and get some respite, which I think is an idea that we're familiar with from a lot of minority population scenarios, that people like an opportunity to sort of withdraw into a safe space and mentally recharge or whatever. And it can be very, there can be both. I mean, I guess takes are going to get hotter from here on out. But there can both be fundamentals-based reasons why a certain occupation or endeavor primarily skews toward men or to women. But then it's also true that once a space is dominated by men, it can be more hostile to women to be in there. My sister-in-law, trained to be an electrician in California, which is unusual for a woman to do. But she did it. She went through the course. She learned it. She knows how to do professional electricianing. But she found it very unpleasant to be constantly the only woman on these various projects.
I hate
and
this
things
story.
like that.
I hate this story. You've told me this before. That she was trained to be a master electrician, and then the community of electricians was mostly male, and it wasn't great for her.
Right. And so, whether or not, right, you think that there's some ultimate parity out there, right? There's reasons for supportive institutions. And that's, a big part of what she's talking about in the chess situation. I do think chess is an interesting entry point for the sports conversation because, I could offer some guesses as to why the top rankings of chess are male-dominated, but it's not, obvious what the answer is.
Yeah, it's one of these things we're talking about that, there are fewer women who get into chess, but then there are, and I was surprised when you were talking about kind of creating spaces for girls at these tournaments. A lot of chess now is played online. There's these online groups. And of course, it is the internet. So Jennifer Shahade was saying that online harassment is quite common, the same way it is, if you're a woman on the internet doing anything. So, that maybe makes people disinclined to want to keep playing a game if you're being harassed. It's not very fun. So, there's all kinds of reasons. I don't think that anybody is saying, it's the feeble woman's mind that is holding her back from playing chess.
Well,
I don't think.
Okay,
maybe.
I'm going to offer a version of that.
All right,
take.
let's hear it.
So I don't think that a feeble woman's mind is keeping women back from playing chess. I do think that you see in most areas of life that the best and worst performance levels are disproportionately men, that there are more extreme outcomes for men, right, including at the low end. Men are more likely to commit suicide. They're more likely to be in jail. They're more likely to kill themselves in a car wreck, all these kinds of things. And I don't think, only time will tell what happens with chess as more women's programs go and as more girls try the sport and go through it into middle school. Lots of people play chess. I play chess. I go on chess.com and I'm terrible at it, but I find it amusing and, I go forth and do it. I would not be shocked if 50 years from now, it's still the case that if you look at the 100 very best chess players in the world, it's mostly men.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know either, but
I just think that's the case.
I think it's something that we need to open our minds to the possibility of.
I will keep my mind open to that, but I would say before I would really entertain that idea, I would want the digital harassment to go away.
Yeah.
How will we test that theory if you only have, I don't know, so say you've got millions of boys and men playing chess and a tiny fraction of girls and women playing chess. And the reason they're not playing chess is because it's not fun, because it's socially isolating at best and full of harassment at worst. So it's really hard for me to agree that this is an example of male polarization around success.
I don't
know. Maybe.
The main thing I want to say is just the idea here is that it's a myth that gender segregation in conventional, bat and ball type sports is done because men have an advantage, right? And we can see that this is mythological because we do the same thing in chess. But it turns out it's actually not true that we gender segregate chess in that way. Women can and do play in tournaments against men. They win. They don't win most of the time, but they win plenty of the time. And there are many, many, many women who are much better at chess than the average person. Now, you turn that around to basketball, and I think it starts to really strain credulity. I mean, we can see with our eyes that men are taller than women and that tall people have a significant advantage in playing basketball. And it's interesting that this is not just one tweet that's out there, but there has been a chorus of people, I mean, dating way back to the early 80s, probably to the 70s, saying that it doesn't make sense to gender segregate sports. There was an Atlantic piece headlined, "Separating Sports by Sex Doesn't Make Sense." And I think it really does. It makes like a lot of sense. At least if you think it's valuable for there to be like women champions who girls can look up to and can say, it would make my life better to engage in competitive sport. I mean, you could imagine taking the view of like a sexist man from 1930 who's like, who cares? Like, girls just shouldn't play sports.
What frustrates me here about this debate is I sometimes feel like I have gone through the looking glass when I'm saying there are advantages for men in sports. Like, that just seems apparently true on its face. I mean, it's just men are, when you look at the spread, you look at the average spread and you look at you look at an elite male athlete and elite woman athlete, and they tend to have broader shoulders. They have higher lung capacity. They have denser bones. They have bigger muscles. They have a stronger grip, which is a huge advantage in a lot of sports. And it's just on its face. What's going on with this argument that, like you said, it's not new, but it seems that it went kind of dormant for a number of years, that pre-Title IX, there were these different camps, right? That there was a huge movement of feminists who were saying we should do this. We need to invest in girls and women and in sports to foster participation on the merits, that we should have women's sports. We should have women champions, and this is a good thing. And then there's this camp that was saying if you segregate women and men, you're inherently confirming this societal structure in which women are separate.
It's the logic of Brown v. Board of Education, that separate is inherently stigmatizing.
Yes.
And so we shouldn't stigmatize women athletes by putting them into separate competitions.
So what happened then with Title IX was there was the school of thought that kind of emerged from that separate but unequal camp that, okay, well, women have not been invested in sports. So if we invest in girls early on, we have coaching, we have facilities, we have equal investment, that over time what you're going to see happen is more girls and women will be competing with men on the same footing. What has happened, though, and in some ways, so it's depending on how you're defining success. Title IX, for, I played sports my whole childhood, and I think that sports is good, that girls should play sports. It's good on a number of levels, health-wise, social-wise, there are all these benefits. I would see Title IX as a success in that pre-Title IX, there was hardly any women who were collegiate athletes, and now 43% of collegiate athletes are women, and I think that's good. The camp of we shouldn't segregate sports kind of went dormant for a period of time, or just wasn't a sort of mainstream idea. But now I've really seen it cropping up in recent weeks and months. I mean, it was, the Atlantic, but there was also the Washington Post. Monkey Cage ran a very similar piece.
Last year, yeah.
Yeah, or I guess it was a year ago. But in any case, it's this idea on the left that is, I wouldn't call it mainstream, but certainly it's more in the mix and being taken seriously as an idea that maybe we shouldn't have women's sports.
Right. And so I think it's important to understand that this is becoming, once again, a much more mainstream argument. It was Elizabeth Sharrow, is, I guess, a political scientist. She was writing on the Monkey Page. And, she's doing this scholarship to show that the original intent of Title IX was to serve as like a bridge toward ending gender segregation, right, to achieve true equality. But then instead of saying, like, that's an interesting bit of history, but what we learned on the way is that women's sports are a success on their own terms, she's saying, like, we should go forth, right, and move back to that equality. And I think it's important just to, like, grasp the factual baseline here. And I really do think that this is important, that these takes about how we shouldn't gender segregate sports are not coming from high-level women athletes.
Right.
Right. And I actually think that's incredibly important, right? If you go back to the 1950s, the people saying separate but equal education is bad, were the leading African-American attorneys and doctors and activists and elected officials in the country.
Right.
They were looking with their own eyes at the situation and saying, this is not what we want. This is bad. It wasn't like somebody else, right? Sitting on the sidelines being like, hey, you know what? You guys shouldn't be going to your own schools.
This was an advocacy movement.
And women professional athletes do advocate for themselves. So the U.S. national women's soccer team is really, really good, thanks to Title IX. Right? American women's soccer is the top program in the world. American men's soccer is obviously not the top men's soccer program in the world. And, we know the history of that. But the men were getting paid more than the women because, in general, male athletes get paid more than women. So the women's soccer team advocated for equal pay. They are world champions. They're at the top of the world. They say, they deserve to get paid. They absolutely did not advocate that they should compete against men for spots on the men's national team, or that they wanted to play against the German and Brazilian men's teams.
No, they were making the case that there's real value to their team independently, that this women's soccer team as an entity, as a force, and as a cultural phenomenon, that they make a lot of money.
And,
they do.
Serena Williams says, as the women's champion,
yes,
I should play for just as much prize money as Roger Federer. She does not say, I want to play against Roger Federer and only get paid if I can beat him. And it's really it's no knock on her, but it's fine for intellectuals and activists to come up with opinions. That's what I do. But you have to listen to what the people who are impacted by these ideas are saying. We could have a world where the top women sprinters were saying, I'm just as fast as any man, let me run the race. But they are not saying that because they're not as fast as any man. You look at the women who set 100-meter dash, they win gold medals at the Olympics. They are very fast, but they're fast like a men's high school champion. They're not as fast as adult. And it's I think it's weird that one even has to discuss this. They're not as big or as strong.
Okay, so this is
I think we can see this in the world.
I'm, it should not be controversial to say that there are physical differences between male and female athletes. And I know this because it's very visually apparent. Personally, I played sports, and I wouldn't, I wouldn't want to run in a track race against boys because I would lose terribly. I wanted to compete with other competitors who were in the same realm. Anyway, what drives me, I think if I were to, I was thinking about this, what is it that drives me nuts about this? And if I distill it down, it's that this is a group of, I would say, intellectuals on the left who in any other context, global warming, COVID, whatever, it's all about we have to follow the science. And yet in this case, it's they just are not willing to look at the science in an open, critical way. That it's this dismissal of facts that have been well documented. And they come back with sort of this idea of original intent. There was this was in the take, right? It's this idea of, figure skating was segregated as soon as a woman started winning. Mm-hmm. And so therefore that today is the reason why we still segregate sports. Look, I don't know about the exact history of figure skating. I don't know what was going on in the 40s. I don't know about this one woman skating or not skating, or if she was wronged or not. But we can look now at these programs and see that the issue isn't that male figure skaters don't want women competing with them because they're afraid they're going to lose to them. Women want to compete with other women because they it's a competitive environment.
Well,
and you wouldn't win. You wouldn't.
The
women
the
just
men
don't
jump higher.
They
right?
jump higher. They jump farther. You know what? And on its merits, women's figure skating. Yeah, we also see women are more flexible. You see a lot of the spinning with a woman who has her blade on the head with it's ridiculous, right? And men tend to not excel in that way, but they you have to do a quadruple loop nowadays pretty much to be able to win, and you're just jumping higher and farther than a woman is, and these women they're not saying we want to compete with men, and two, a lot of people enjoy watching women's sports on the merits.
That's what I was going to say.
It's almost like a different sport. I have become a kind of figure skating aficionado over the years. I have a friend who, anyway, she wrote a blog and kind of got me into it. And I like watching men's and women's figure skating, but I'm like watching totally different sports that I enjoy on the merits of the sport.
This is what I want to say is that, there's the question of facts, there's the science, right? But I think fundamentally there's also a question of values here, right? Because part of the claim, right, the invocation of the separate and equal concept, sarcastically, is the idea that it's inherently stigmatizing to women to be in these separate categories.
Yes.
And no, it is clearly true that men's basketball is a much more popular and lucrative sport than women's basketball, and that globally men's soccer is much more popular and lucrative than women's soccer. But we do have these other examples. Women's gymnastics and women's figure skating are more popular and more mainstream sports than the men's competition. There are more girls than boys who are interested in going into those fields. There's more audience for the women athletes. And so it's not true that the gender segregation inherently positions the women as lesser than when construed as an entertainment.
Yeah,
right? Which is like what it is.
Right,
It's both
spectator
it's an opportunity for competitors to compete.
Yes.
It's an opportunity for people to become famous and get cereal box sponsorships. And it's an opportunity for viewers at home to watch things that they enjoy. And it's an opportunity for young people, the vast majority of whom are never going to be in the Olympics, to take up a hobby that is healthy, that develops mental discipline, et cetera, et cetera. We all know the names of famous American women gymnasts because that's a more mainstream competition. It's still true that if you put them on, men gymnasts literally do different exercises because the men do this weird ring thing that's all about having strong arms and shoulders.
Yeah.
And on some level, it's just sports, right? It's a big business, but it's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be something people want to watch. And so you're trying to construct competitions that are enjoyable. In baseball, right? They're right now nothing to do with gender. They're going to change the rules
to make it more fun to watch.
So the pitchers need to pitch faster because they think the games have gotten boring. And there's no you can't peer into the cosmos and get the correct answer about this. You just have to decide. Obviously, women have played tennis matches against men. In human history.
Sure.
If people thought that was fun to watch, or it's something that women wanted to do all the time, we could do it. It's not illegal. But it's not how the sport is organized.
One thing I also wonder about this camp is, so this is not a camp of elite athletes. Are they even spectators of sports? Because I don't think so. These do not seem like sports aficionados, right? This doesn't seem like have they not seen American football and seen that it would be very difficult for a woman to make the NFL? Do they not see that? And how, or I don't know, or track? Who would want to? It's not fun to watch. This would be really sad. It would just look lame. Or I know that's awful, but it's you want to watch Jackie Joyner Kersey run against other women because it's whoa, these ladies are fast and they're incredible athletes, and it's incredible to watch and it's thrilling. But
let's take a break.
Yeah,
and I think
we
talk
need to,
about the elephant in the room here.
Yeah. Okay.
So you sketched out the history of this before, which I think is correct, right? Early feminist advocates, sort of inspired by the civil rights movement, were maybe looking toward total gender integration in sports. They wound up creating something different from that, which was funding equality and like these big collegiate and high school, increasingly, women's sports programs. And this whole idea kind of went dormant for a while.
Well, I also want to say one thing I was sort of thinking about as we've been talking about this is no one would have predicted, I don't think, pre-Title IX that the U.S. would have a women's soccer team so popular that they are in and of themselves a franchise, and that I bet more Americans know the names of
Megan Rapinoe and the other stars of that team.
The stars of the women's team. And I think that, it's just funny. Like, I don't think that was something that we would have even imagined. And I think it's very cool.
But so the reason this has come back is not because women athletes have been agitating for integration in sports.
Right.
It's because, and if you see these articles, right, both the Atlantic piece and the Washington Post piece, they lead not with, here's a woman competitive athlete and she wants to play against the men and she's not being allowed to do that. What they all lead with is political controversies about trans women who want to play on women's sports teams.
Right.
Which, like, I do want to just, like, formally note, right, like, this is a different question.
I agree.
But what is motivating it is that if there were no such thing as sex-segregated sports, you would then not have this politically dicey question as to which team should a trans woman play on.
Right.
Right. And that is, in fact, how we have addressed trans rights concerns in the majority of contexts. Right. I mean, if you took a time machine back to 2014, 2015, whatever, you asked me, like, Matt, like, where do you stand on trans rights? I'd be like, I'm so for it. Right? Because to me, there were some people who were like, this is like bad. It's like morally wrong. Like, I've got my Bible. I'm thumping on it.
Right.
Like, everybody's got to dress the way I say they should and use the pronoun. And I'm like, no, like, let people do what they want. Like, dress how you want. Like, use what pronouns you want. Use what name you want. Get what medical treatments you want. Like, it's all good. Right? Because in the vast majority of circumstances, it doesn't, like, matter in some ontological sense, like what gender category you're in or none. You can be fluid, you can be non-binary, like it's all fine because most of American society has been reworked to not have gender segregation in it, right? Like the overwhelming majority of colleges are co-ed in a way that wasn't true 100 years ago. Occupations are open to both men and women, right? Like women can fly airplanes. Women can be combat soldiers, right? This was all, like, not true in the past. But now everything is open to people of all genders. And so the stakes of, like, what is your gender identity, quote unquote, really, are, like, actually quite low. And we can just be tolerant, friendly people, or we can be, like, weird Bible-thumping jerks. Right? And sports has become this edge case.
Yes, there's a different
where the
situation.
Existence of gender-segregated sports creates a problem for trans inclusion because the whole point of there being a women's-only tennis competition is that there needs to be some decision from on high as to which people are the women.
Right.
Right? And that then creates a difficulty around the question of, do trans women count?
Right.
And I think that this is a question that should be discussed in a humane and sensitive way. But what I think you see happening in these intellectual circles is this kind of like wishful thinking, right? Which is, well, we have a tough argument here, right? We're not persuading people necessarily. So what if we could invoke some just like wrong facts and say the whole idea of gender segregation doesn't make sense, in which case the whole issue vanishes. And like that would be extremely convenient. And I think it's why you have a certain number of college professors and other people with no actual stake in or connection to women's sports kind of being like blah, blah, blah.
Well, what's interesting
But like it's not true.
Well, okay, it's not true. And to go back to your point about who is advocating for this, trans women are advocating to be part of women's...
Yes, they're also not advocating
No, they want to be, there's trans women athletes who want to participate in women's leagues. Yeah, that really is the dominant tension around the issue of trans
Well, that's
inclusion.
what I mean. It's not
just to be
women's
clear,
sports champions who are advocating for this.
Right.
And it is also not trans women athletes who are advocating for the end of gender segregation. Trans women athletes are asking to play on the women's team.
Yes.
It's bystanders.
Right. It's bystanders who are saying, here's an interesting, to them, to me, I'm looking at this of, okay, you're not an athlete. You don't seem to be a real aficionado of sports. It's this intellectual argument in the abstract of, okay, well, if we got rid of this whole construct, like you're saying, then we don't have to deal with this question of what team a trans player should play on.
Which I totally get. Like, imagine you are the typical American college professor, right? You are committed to progressive politics, right? Like you want that brand. You don't want progressive activists to be mad at you. You also work in a university environment. The university runs these sports teams. You don't personally care about those sports teams, but you are aware that other people do care.
Sure.
So on the one hand, you have activists saying this person should be on the women's swim team. Then you have other people who are freaking out and they're like, oh, no, she absolutely shouldn't be on the women's swim team. You're sitting there. You don't care about the swim team. You want everybody to go away. Right? And like an idea that would make this problem vanish off your desk is like, what if there's no good reason for gender segregated sports teams? And like, absolutely. If there were no good reason, you would make this thorny political question about what to do with trans women's athletes go away. And that would be very convenient. But like, it's not true. Right? Just like I wish I had bigger hands and I could palm a basketball and then I would be good at playing my favorite sport.
Yeah.
But like I don't. So I don't, like you have to deal with reality.
Look, reality is reality. And it's, and this is probably a useless, I'm like, I can palm basketball. I have freakishly large hands and feet too for my height. I also just think, okay, yes, you're a professor thinking this, but generally as a professor, you are in pursuit. You're in pursuit of information that is true.
Yes,
and so
I don't mean to slander all professors.
Well, and also just to note, there really is a school of thought of people who have been committed to this idea for a long time.
Yeah.
There's this journal in Berkeley's Women's Law Journal that I see surfacing in this conversation a lot, and it's from the 80s, and it was around this idea, and it's really about a legal argument about women and legal representation and sort of fairness under the law. But to achieve that, like you're saying, to make the analogy between race and education and women and sports, the deal with race and education is that Black children and white children are not different. There's no ability difference there, that this was a purely discriminatory decision to give one group of people less resources and because they were under the law not treated equally. The problem is that women and men are not like race. And there's this argument of biology. Literally, I've seen the phrase, biology is a social construct. There's the idea that race is a social construct, right? That it's sort of this artificial way of differentiating people. Biology is not an idea. It's a reality.
There's a simplistic copying and pasting of a political template.
Yes.
Because, if you look at the historical sequence of events, right, clearly the civil rights movement led pretty directly as like a sociological matter into a new big wave of feminist activity, right? There's like a real linkage, right, sociologically, politically, historically, between the civil rights movement and second wave feminism. So that led to a certain amount of like rhetorical copying and a certain amount of conceptual copying, but some of that doesn't work, right? Like, you can very coherently say that, like, race is a social construct, like, we shouldn't care. Everybody should be treated exactly the same, regardless of the color of their skin. We should judge people on the content of their character, like that whole thing. Men and women, in fact, are different. And equality in that case has to mean, and I think for the overwhelming majority of women has always meant something different from treating people as if they were identical, right? It means taking their interests into account equally in making of decisions, which in the case of sports means creating a distinct class of women champions, of women's competitions, of women's ability to participate at all levels of sport, and does include, I mean, there is a co-ed rec soccer league that plays across the street from my house.
I know someone in that league.
Okay,
who lives in my house.
These are people.
Yes.
These are people who like they're good. They
yes.
take it seriously, but they are not like top 1% competitors.
No, they do it for fun.
But
I
think most of those women learned their skills playing high school and college competitive soccer on women's teams. And, and even so, even in the context of the co-ed league, there's like special rules about how many women have to be on the field at any given time, et cetera, et cetera. Because again, what you're trying to do in this situation is take everyone's interests as equally important. Right.
Yes.
And construct something that's good. Right.
Yes.
You're not saying, well, we are going to achieve equality by pretending we can't see what's going on.
Right. And it's very obvious that, in the league, you have a certain number of women on the field at any time. And if you don't, you have to subtract male players. Mm-hmm. And the idea is to have a competitive game each weekend, right? Like you don't want one team to be all men and then the team you're playing to be 70% women, because what you're going to have is an uneven game.
Well, you also don't want the leadership of the team to not want women to join.
Yes.
Right? You don't want a team to put itself in this case,
well,
right?
No, I mean, okay. It's also, and this also gets uncomfortable, but, in these co-ed leagues, there's a mindfulness of don't belt the ball at your female, competitor, and you got to be, just a little less perhaps rough if you're a, 6 foot tall kind of buff dude going up. It's like, it's not that the female players are not good at soccer. It's just that biologically
they're smaller.
They're smaller. And so there's a sort of cognizance there of the reason you also balance a team is that like you want both teams playing at the same type of level for everybody to enjoy the game and, basic safety as well. But yes, you're right. You don't want to create teams where, because over time maybe you just it would just turn into, a single gender league, which isn't the point. I want to get back to the idea of sameness, that in other contexts, sports, I think, is almost what's funny is it seems like the most obvious, easy conversation to have. And yet here we are. But an old friend of mine is a feminist writer. Well, she writes on other topics too, but really I'd consider her a feminist writer, Anne Friedman. And she wrote a number of years ago about, I think it was when a Chinese Olympian didn't swim her best. And she told a reporter, oh yeah, my period started and I just wasn't feeling my best and I didn't swim my best. And it was kind of explosive to like openly talk about that. And it became kind of a conversation in circles amongst professional women too of, okay, we've fought to say, I'm at the table, I'm leaning in, here I am, I want to be taken seriously and given the same responsibilities, and I want, to be treated as a man. I can do a man's job, equal pay, equal work, I can do the same thing. And then we start to grapple with questions of biology that, well, what happens when I'm pregnant? What happens when, I'm dealing with, there are just medical situations, whether it is menstruation to pregnancy to miscarriage to these things that are circumstances unique to women. And how do we strive for equality in the workplace while also acknowledging, hey, actually, we are different. And I also want to think about, well, I don't want that to become an exception, a sort of, well, there's the standard in work, and then we will carve out special exceptions for you pregnant person and you, or whatever, that you don't want to become a carve out, but your difference is just considered well, yeah, we all have certain needs. And like you're saying, are we equally taking everyone's interests into account?
But I mean, there's also the converse, right? I mean, I mentioned this earlier, but men and boys are very overrepresented among the worst outcomes in a variety of cases. And, Richard Reeves has this good new book out that is, it's very focused on things like the extremely high school dropout rate of boys, right?
Yeah,
Which,
I think we should do a show on this because
sure.
This
I mean, it's an
the
interesting
drop off of boys and men in this country around education and achievement is just stunning, and we need to do something.
Right, and
to help boys.
Part of what he says is that so the teaching profession has become actually more women dominated in the sort of post-feminist era, which I think is a little bit it's like a little bit counterintuitive because we think of that as the classic professional job that women did have access to before the 1970s,
right.
But it's more women dominated than ever. And he cites evidence to show that boys do better when they have some male teachers rather than literally none.
Right.
And so we should maybe be cognizant of that. And it's such a mild intervention,
right?
Honestly, right? This is not we need to deny that women also have lots of different problems and disadvantages, right? But hire some men to teach in elementary schools. But it does require you to acknowledge that boys and girls are different and may respond differently to different things, and that just as being the only girl at the chess tournament could be an intimidating situation that leads you to do less than your best at it, that having a school environment for years and years and years in which you don't encounter any men in authority being this is school, we're doing this,
right?
And it makes it more challenging, right?
And it becomes tricky to say, there's lots of kind of clubs, girls in STEM and girls who code, to try to do the same for boys. That I suspect that is a hard case to make, especially with people on the left of. And I started out, I kind of favored this view for a long time of this is not, I saw it as this is a success story for girls, not a negative story. It's being spun as a negative story for boys. But I've changed my view that it's clearly boys are falling behind. And I think it would be very hard to pull off a club of reading club for boys or, getting boys in math, a boys math club or something like that, where we have these preconceived ideas about where men excel. And there would be some discomfort with that, I think, of creating spaces for boys to catch up and to succeed. I suspect, and then even this question of getting more men into the field of education, I think would be controversial if there was, so AmeriCorps or something had this special sub-program of recruiting college men to get into teaching, specifically trying to get those numbers up, I think would be really politically dicey.
Yeah, I mean, and look.
I don't know if we should do it or not, but, well, I've seen the same research, and it seems like there's real value for boys who are otherwise falling behind. There's just real evidence that if they have a male teacher in their elementary school career, it makes a difference in their lives.
Right. So anyway, not to get too derailed into Reeves,
I know,
which could be its own episode, but
yeah.
I mean, it is just a thing that we continue to see in society outside of the sports domain is that if you look at who are the senators, who are the governors, who's in the cabinet, who are the CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies, it's very male dominated.
Right.
Right. And that is the case even though there is a structure of formal equality, right? There aren't 0 women CEOs or senators or governors or cabinet members. You are absolutely allowed to do those things, but we see that women are not, achieving at those levels in equal numbers, and that seems to have a lot to do with childbirth and parenting and other things like that, and not just like the rule has to say you're allowed to do it, right? That life is complicated and men and women are different. And most of these elite social structures were set up at a time when only men were allowed to participate in them. And achieving equality probably requires adjustments beyond formal equality. But those adjustments have to be cognizant of the difference between men and women, right? Like it's different. And then we also see boys doing worse in the low end. And, in some cases, the remedy can just be like a normal remedy. It's like better for everyone who's struggling, and that happens to be disproportionately boys, and so it's all good. But like very plausibly, some of the interventions have to take into account the fact that, boys in, I guess, most measures sort of mature a little bit slower than women. Boys and men at all ages are just more risk-taking. Right. And that's something you see in all kinds of venues of activity that's important to like know about society. Right. Even if you don't have like there's overlap between the distributions, et cetera, but like that's how things go. And we need to know that. And I think that we should be respectful of people's desires to like live their lives in the way they want to, but we shouldn't sacrifice like basic knowledge that we all have to that end. It's what to me is so. I know some people don't like to fight, with people on their own side, and a lot of people are really bothered by the level of discussion about these kind of trans sports inclusion type issues because so few people are involved. And so they say,
yes.
why are we
even talking about this?
Why are we even talking? And I mean, I agree on one level, but I also see that the other way, right? That you have a group of people, again, not super mainstream, but getting published in major magazines and major newspapers who want to resolve the inclusion issues of a very, very small number of trans athletes by throwing overboard really well-established information about sex differences in sports competition in a way that would be quite harmful. And it's important to, stand up for, like, reality, right? And you can incorporate the specific concerns of trans athletes, I think, in different ways according to what you think, like which set of values you think is most important, et cetera, but trying to just sort of like resolve these coalitional tensions by making up like a fake history of chess tournaments and a set of fake biological facts about figure skating and all these other things, like it's not going to lead you to any kind of good conclusions ultimately in the world. So much of the progress that's been made for women has come through things like Title IX
I
programs.
want to pause that point that you just made, which is, this idea that you're going to harm the progress in sports. And the other unintended consequence, I do believe that, this whole thing is kind of, the claim is that this is not going to harm women's participation in sports, which I just think is patently just doesn't make any sense. Two, there's a quote in a New York Times story that ran. It was laying out the debate over trans sports specifically, and there was a quote from an activist who is also a lawyer who said, yes, there's a tiny number of trans athletes who are challenging the rules, but in the law, the issue is precedent. And so if right now one person challenges Title IX and the structure of Title IX, that you're not just creating a precedent for the NCAA, but what you could end up doing is tossing a law or structures under the law that have that really add up to a much larger project. Title IX is also about education. It's not just about sports. So if you're tossing one piece of that law, you're threatening much larger like you're just threatening much larger investments, whether that is saying, okay, why is it that, we've got so few women in the Senate, and we want to create systems to improve that or to increase that, or we're seeing these those real falling behind of boys. Well, we want to target that and think about how to fix that. If you're creating this precedent that, well, this is all a social construct and there is no biological differences here, that we just need to open everything up, open up the field. If you open it up in sports, it's sort of this question of what happens in other venues.
Well, and I also do want to say another thing that I read the other day that sort of annoyed me was this was a conservative, think tank article. They were talking about the Republican Study Committee's agenda for families, and it referred at one point to, they had some innovative ideas, but also some bread and butter conservative ideas. And on the list of bread and butter conservative ideas was like school choice and also protecting girls' sports.
Oh, yes. Let's also talk about
And I
this.
chortled because, it's obviously not true that conservatives have had a deep commitment to the integrity of girls' sports. And I am not as conservative as conservatives, but I do want to not be up here posing as Mr. Women's sports are the most important thing in the world to me. What I think is most important about all of this is just commitment to facticity. And if somebody wants to make the argument that look, as a question of cosmic values, I just think it is inappropriate to have gender segregated sports leagues. And if the consequence of that is that all the Olympic medals are won by men, I'm okay with that. I don't know. I mean, that would be, I think, an interesting debate, right? If a newspaper were to run an op-ed with that thesis, if somebody were to write a magazine feature with that thesis, I would think that might be a worthy intellectual contribution to the conversation. And then we could have a discussion about the value of women's sports and back and forth. And it's not something I've thought incredibly deeply about, and it might be interesting to see debated.
I don't think so. But nonetheless, I agree with you.
But when I see people saying things that are
let me just, I'm all I'm seeing right now is our Apple reviews being Laura, she's a belligerent interrupter, which is probably true. But anyway, I'm interrupting you because sometimes you make double barrel points and then I forget to address the first one. But I agree with you that you can't have a debate when the premise isn't true.
Right.
And we see this in every avenue, in all kinds of things going on in life right now, right? You have to accept that Joe Biden won the election before you can really talk about politics. And in this case, you can't throw out just obvious conclusions about differences between men and women to then start having this other conversation. So I agree with that.
And that's why it's important to acknowledge that this isn't what women athletes are asking for. That if you were saying, let's eliminate gender segregated sports, you are not making an empowering argument on behalf of women athletes. You're making a very retrograde argument that the creation of these women's champions and stuff has no value.
And to your point of, okay, if somebody was saying, look, I don't think we should have women's sports, and if the consequence of that is there are no more women champions, consequences be damned. I personally, I think on some intellectual or legal argument or whatever that is acceptable. I don't think that's, to me, it's I can't even imagine that. The thing that I don't think the Washington Post would run that, right? I don't think they would, because it would be
but that's what's so weird
So
about the current moment.
Yes, that's why. Because if you actually based your opinion on a set of real facts, it'd be wow, that's really sexist. That's wild. That's wild. You just think women should not be involved at all. You just are fine.
Right. Bye women's soccer team.
Yeah, goodbye. We don't need this. This is, you're not deserving of playing sports because you are weaker than a man. It just wouldn't be a real conversation. It just wouldn't even make it. The Atlantic would not run that. But somehow they're running the Washington Post and the Atlantic, and the idea flying around on Twitter. It's exactly the same thing. The outcome is exactly the same. But if you start with this false premise, is somehow tenable and acceptable to have this conversation in polite and intellectual circles.
Right. You're putting a progressive mask on an argument that's like actually so right wing that like nobody will advance it.
Like Mitch
because
McConnell's
it's
not going to
crazy.
go. No. Yeah, like you're not going to have. Mitch McConnell's not going to be out there going no more women's sports. I mean, Donald Trump isn't going to be out there saying no women's sports. I mean, this is just not. That's just so beyond the pale at this point. And to me, that's that's the success of the project of the last 50 years of getting girls and women involved in sports. That's the success of it. So to now mask that totally unacceptable view with this sheen of, I think, especially language about separate and unequal. It's like, wow, you are using the language of the civil rights movement to put forward a really nasty agenda, and is like being peddled in polite society. That's where I feel we are.
Heating up the takes there. Okay, so we should probably start to wrap up around here. I mean, I think we both agree this is a bad take. It's not even true that women can't compete against men in chess tournaments, but it is at the kind of the thin edge of a wedge of sort of bad takes that are out there. This has been another episode of Bad Takes from Grid. Our producer is Olivia Reingold. I want to thank everybody who's been listening and supporting the show. And I really do want to urge you, if you like the show, like go into iTunes, go into other podcast platforms.
I'm going to interrupt Matt because it's a joke, but don't say I'm interrupting.
Give us a star, write us a nice review, say, you enjoy the banter and repartee that is here. It's important. I mean, this is how podcast audiences grow, through word of mouth, through recommendations, through good ratings, through good reviews. So, your work here matters. Thanks, everyone, and we'll be back next week with more Bad Takes.